Hey, everybody, and welcome to The Brand Called You. So listen, when I was first getting out of college, my very first professional job as a storyteller was at the New York Historical Society. And it was basically a museum devoted to New York history. And they would ask me to bring to life the stories of the exhibits they were doing. And so they gave me complete access to their rare archives. Now, this was such a wonderment to me. I can't tell you. They had this rare children's book collection, and they also had the most wonderful stories about New York history, where I got such juicy pieces of gossip and information about George Washington and Aaron Burr and all of our colonial leaders. And it's really from those archives that I began to value and understand the beauty of a historic book. I remember the smells of the library, the textures of those books, and then, of course, the writing itself, which was really very different than a book you would find today, even one on history, which is why I'm so excited for our guest today, Florina Jenkins. Florina did not start off in the way she is now with Chase Rare Books, specializing as a rare bookseller. In fact, she had a trajectory that took her there, which we're going to talk about. But I am fascinated by anybody who would have the audacity and the daring to start a rare bookstore. And so I want to welcome you, Florina. And thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
You are the owner and the founder of Chase Rare Books, based in London, although I believe, unlike my first experience with rare books, your bookstore is not a physical bookstore. Am I right?
Yes, well, I do have the physical books, but I sell them online.
Right.
Correct. Yes.
My first question to you is, and again, I'm a dinosaur, so just ignore me for this question, but is there something, do you miss this physical space and the smells and the textures that come from it, or am I just thinking in a too old-fashioned way? Is there some benefit also to not having that?
Well, my house is virtually a library, so I'm surrounded by books everywhere. So it doesn't feel like I'm not in a bookshop. It is, my house is filled with books that are mine to read, books that I sell. So as you see behind me, and this is the rest of my house, it's just the same.
What about for the customer? Is it a different kind of customer now? Or was there a customer who used to like to go and just touch them and feel them in a bookstore, or has it changed?
It's interesting because a lot of people do like to go into bookshops, and I do go myself, and I buy books from other book dealers, and I visit them, and I enjoy it very much. But there's also the other type of rare book buyer who prefers to buy online. And if you have pictures and descriptions, people have no problem buying books online. And as a matter of fact, during the pandemic, the book trade was flourishing because a lot of people were home with nothing to do, and they were buying books online. I'm sure that they're buying other things, but that was interesting in our trade, that people were really buying a lot of physical books.
That's so interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that sector discussed before, and I bet I wouldn't be surprised if it was even an influx of rare books that were being bought at that time.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So I'm fascinated by this because you didn't start out as a bookseller. You were if I'm not mistaken, weren't you in financial hedge funds at Bear Stearns when you first started?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, from banking to books.
So tell me, how does you had a successful career in New York, right, as a hedge fund manager, I believe. How does one suddenly go from that to this very, very intellectual, spiritual, and literary world? How does that happen? Were you disenchanted with the finance world?
Well,
or
to
bored?
say that perhaps we can go back to my childhood and the love of books. That I always loved books.
Where were you born? Where were you born?
So I was born in Bucharest,
Okay.
in Romania. And so I loved books ever since I can remember, even before I could read. And once I started reading, that was it. It was my favorite thing to do. So the fact that years later, I ended up in banking doesn't mean that, I was a book person all my life. And when I got to the point that I left banking, it was because I guess I wanted to do what I really loved, which was to study books. So I went back for a master's. I went back to school for a master's in literature, and I found perhaps what was then the job of my dreams, which was in a old and venerable antiquarian bookseller in London called Bernard Quaritch. So so that is my journey. The books and literature was always there. And I tried my hand at having a normal job kind of thing. It was an interesting experience working in banking at Bear Stearns in New York and London at the time when it was perhaps a golden age of the hedge fund. And Bear Stearns was providing finance for the biggest, the largest, and the most prestigious hedge funds in the United States and Europe.
Well, I have a few friends that were in finance at that time, and they said it was a super decadent time where you had unbelievable corporate perks. It was before the crash. Is that were you in the New York of those days?
I was in the New York of those days, in Europe of those days. So I transferred to London, and from London I traveled all across Europe for meetings, and it was at times quite glamorous, especially in Paris. I used to love going to Paris. Lunch at Georges V, staying at Hotel de Crillon. So it was all very, very nice. And actually, Hotel de Crillon reminds me that when I went there first, I just remember that Hemingway wrote about it in The Sun Also Rising. And he was waiting. He went to the Hotel de Crillon to wait for his lover, and his lover wasn't there. And he started writing some letters. And he said, well, those letters were not very, very good, but they were written on the hotel stationery. So that makes them better.
It's funny you say that, because I think, any of us who are literature lovers, at least for me, when I went to Paris, I was really immediately transported to the salons of Gertrude Stein. I was thinking of Edna St. Vincent Millay having her love affair with Henry Miller, or whatever, And I wonder if even when you were trading hedge funds, if you were always, wherever you travel, you still were always have a literary.
Always, there's a life mixes with literature, and characters in books become almost as vivid as real characters, and they're part of your world.
Did you find yourself in between meetings, decadent meetings as they were? Did you find yourself were you always collecting rare books even before you knew you would find a career in it?
Yes, so everywhere I traveled, I would, if I had time, I would go to bookshops, and it's interesting because no matter what country you are in, you're going into an antiquarian bookshop, and they're a good specialist. They understand that you're a collector, and you feel at home. So everywhere you go in the world, you feel. You enter this space of a bookshop, and you feel that you're at home.
You're in a secret club.
Yes, I suppose it's like this with bridge. Your brother plays bridge, and wherever you go in the world, you go to a bridge club. You're part of the family. You're at home.
But I was going to say, there's not the competitive edge, is there? What do you think you share spiritually with other old, really, old booksellers, classic booksellers, as opposed to new book lovers? What do you think that is there a spirit, a shared spirit?
mean, of course, there is a shared spirit, and we always try to do the best we can, describe books in the most honest and a possible way. And so we have values, common values, and but how is it an online bookshop? You probably miss having colleagues and discussing, although, you could do this over the phone and when you visit, or at different functions when you meet your colleagues from other bookshops. But I mean, when I started at Quaritch was established in 1847. So when I started in 2008, I mean, it was still kind of like in the 19th century, in a good way. I mean, in a good way. So coming from the kind of like intense investment banking environment, and the screeniness where you have like all sorts of screens surrounding you, to the hushed atmosphere of this venerable old shop, where you have these incredible books that are really, most of them end up in museums, really. So there were, so you felt like modernity didn't quite reach within that tempo of books.
What was the most exciting old book that you ever laid your hands on?
Oh my goodness, I expected this kind of question. There is, of course, there is the first edition of the Iliad.
Really?
The first edition, the printed Iliad, printed in like 1497. That was quite amazing.
Where was that? Where did you see that or find that or touch that?
That was at Quaritch. That was at Quaritch. Yes. They had, they had tens of thousands of books, but just to give a few examples, they had a first edition of Galileo's most famous book, where he wrote "A pur si muove," and yet it moves, referring to the Earth moving around the sun. And the first book I bought for them was also one of my favorite books of all times. It's called The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. And it has to do with one of my obsessions, which is the end of empires. And this book has to do with the end of Austria-Hungary. But it's so beautifully written, so lyrical and so touching. So I sold that book.
Does your do you have any memory of Ceausescu in Romania? Were you there during the fall of communism, or had you already left by then?
One of the things so while I was at Berna Quaritch, they didn't quite do modern books, which is absolutely fine. But really, my passion is for modern books, and that comes from 20th century. 20th century, you have all these events, wars, First World War, Second World War, and they all have their impact on people from maybe your family, and so 1989 is just another reversal of fortunes in terms of, and on a whole, is the fall of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Empire. Whereas, World War I had to do with the end of Austria-Hungary. And
I have a sort of content question for you, because in my early days doing research at the New York Historical Society, and then later when I went to work at the Museum of the City of New York, so I was doing a lot of research early books. When I say early for America, we're talking about 1700s, 1800s, and so forth. And what I found consistently in these historical books was there was a lot of gossip and stories that they felt free to present as history that I think today the legal teams would not allow to be published, that there was much more license with truth in books that were supposedly historic in nature. And I guess I was just going to ask you if that's true in all subject matter. I mean, for me, it was a dream as a storyteller to hear these great stories, but I thought, I don't think that this could pass muster today at all. I don't know. I was just curious.
I mean, when you go and research, you go into archives, you find all sorts of things, sometimes controversial things, and, about an author that you're researching, or and then, what do you do with these facts? How do you put them into context? Do you even go there, or, so archives are different from books. They are definitely fascinating and surprising.
You said that your favorite, one of your favorite subjects to collect is, if I'm not mistaken, travel books, historic travel books.
Yes, travel books. I'd say that. Yes, I mean, literary fiction is one of my favorite, my probably my favorite, and travel books as well. And I love travel guides from the past, and who doesn't like to have a travel guide from the past and go, take them as guides for today's,
Is that true? That's what a great idea, actually, when you go traveling, to bring a historic travel guide.
Yes.
Well,
I just recently sold a guide to Paris, published in 1815. It was a small book in a very small, small format, and was beautifully bound in contemporary leather with, gilt titles. It looked really, really good as well. But it was really interesting because it was before the transformation of Paris by Baron Haussmann under Napoleon III in the second part of the 19th century. So it deals with a pre-Haussmannization Paris, and this one had a lot of, for the tourist. I mean, it had a lot of information, like you were saying earlier, about brothels and gambling dens, and a disturbing number of types of prostitutes, courtesans, and so forth. But also places where you could go shopping, very modern at the same time. And of course, monuments and museums and so forth.
And then I noticed you also have a kind of fascination with dust jacket art. Is that true?
Yes. So,
tell me about them. They were obviously, it was a hand painted technique, I'm assuming, in its day, or.
So, the modern book, one of the modern book comes with a dust jacket. Before that, in the Victorian times, you would have, generally speaking, a triple decker. Literary fiction came in a 3-volume format, and they're bound in cloth, probably. So with the turn of the 20th century, the modern book appears, and with it appears this detachable printed dust jacket. And for a long time, people thought that it had no significance whatever, and even the most venerable libraries, they would throw them away. And now it's understood that actually the dust jacket is part of without it the book is not complete. So for a book to be complete, it does have to have the dust jacket, and also because the dust jacket, it's a product of, say, 20th century. Well, it's from before that, but it flourishes in the 20th century, and it attracts a lot of illustrators and graphic artists. Also, dust jackets have blurbs, interesting blurbs, what people are saying at the time of publication about the book. So the dust jacket now has its place in art history,
Wow.
and it's important and it's attractive. So when you have a book that has its a rare book that has its dust jacket, which is unfaded, unclipped, unblemished, and you know the artist, you know who the artist is and how it links with the contents of the book, it just creates a much more interesting story, and it's also an object of beauty. Just like in the old days, people used to go to buy their books, which were like, for instance, in the 18th century, the bookseller would sell them in boards, and then people would go, generally speaking, wealthy people would go to their binder, and the binder would bind them in leather. That's why you have the old libraries that are all done in leather. So the modern equivalent is, it's the dust jacket. This is how, and the beauty of a book is now, the exterior beauty of the book is now determined by the dust jacket. So
Wow.
for instance, to give you an example, Andy Warhol started his career as a commercial artist, and he designed a number of dust jackets. So the book itself might not have merit, but certainly it's a collectible book because of the dust jacket.
Yeah, I often go to museums and see the early artists' work, and it's usually something of that nature. So something we don't think about. What is the oldest book that you personally have owned or have bought and sold?
Right now, we actually have some fragments of medieval manuscript.
Wow.
Yes, from another interesting thing that happens here with books is provenance. So these fragments come from a collector, a British collector of Ruskin. He was obsessed with Ruskin, with John Ruskin. And Ruskin, who was part of this, was friends with William Morris and the pre-Raphaelites, they went back to the medieval times. They were kind of like they were living in the modern times of the 19th century, and they didn't quite like the 19th century. So they like to fantasize about the medieval times. So they produced books in the manner of William Morris, in the manner of medieval manuscripts. But at any rate, if you are into Ruskin, you will probably collect medieval manuscripts and things like that. So from this collector, I was able to buy this 4 fragments of a French Bible from the 13th century. And it's interesting how these fragments came about. They, at some point in time, nobody knows when, the manuscript was, the pages of the manuscript were cut. And at some other point, they were used by a binder for, to bind another book in the 17th century. So these fragments that I have come from this 17th century book that used medieval manuscripts for binding. So it's an interesting history of how these fragments survive. We don't really own them. We just have them for, we're just custodians for a little bit, and then they move on and they survive. Well, hopefully.
I can understand why an archive or a museum would want it, but I think it would be so much more fun to who are the individuals that are putting the stuff in their bookcases.
Yes, absolutely. And some of the most interesting books are not necessarily, they could be the most beautiful and the most interesting, but they, the ones that bear the ownership marks of someone famous or someone that we are fascinated by, or annotated copies of, people have read the book and they wrote on the margins what they thought about it.
Love that.
And yes, and I remember this other booksellers were where I work, the owner used to buy entire collections from people, entire libraries for people, and I would catalog them. And generally speaking, these libraries would be bought after the collector has passed. So as I would catalog the collection, I would get to know the person who collected them, who's now passed away. And a kind of like a weird relationship would be formed between me in the present and the person who's collected these books, and an understanding me of them. And I suppose that perhaps through my interaction with these books and cataloging them, they kind of like are immortal, and then those books go and they're bought by other people, and they, not only the book lives, but the collector himself or herself. There is some sort of immortality that occurs here with when your books that you've collected just travel through time and change hands.
I never imagined when I was talking to you that I would be so deeply moved by your business, but obviously for you, it's not just about reading or even history. It's really about human nature. It's about history. It's about preservation, respect for people. I mean, I feel like in this one area that you're in, you get to practice kind of all of your most core values in a way. No?
Yes, it really is. There is some sort of spiritual side of it, and thinking about you and the interview, I thought that perhaps I haven't talked about Pemberley Books, which was a place that I worked for about 7 years. They specialized in natural history, which is not my interest nor my strength really, but I learned so much. And it was thinking about Pemberley Books is about almost like working in a monastery. Whereas the silence, the concentration, the discipline. And in order to become a good bookseller, you almost have to be in the monastery for a number of years. You have to be there. You have to learn the discipline and to go through those thousands and thousands of books and understand them and understand all aspects of this well, we call it trade, but it's more than a trade. So there is this spiritual side to it where there's a temple or a monastery, but there is this dedication.
Yeah, like a morning ritual chant. But so my last question, because I can't believe we've already out of time, but what are you furiously searching for right now? Is there one or two things that you're yearning to find, or are you open to anything?
Wow, I mean, there's so many things I would like to get my hands on.
What would the Holy Grail be for you?
The Holy Grail. There would certainly be. There would have to be a of one of my favorites, my favorite authors, or an association copy. So an association means that maybe the author had written a dedication to another person who again is someone famous, someone well known. Wow. So what is my I have a list of that I call the list of wants. But
what are your list? What's your list of wants?
I don't have it in front of me, but
give me three. Give me three.
Hold on a second. Let me see if I can find. I'm certainly fascinated by Truman Capote. So I would very much like to have a first edition of Breakfast at Tiffany's, and if it were really inscribed by him, I would definitely I would definitely go for it. I mean, I'm searching for it, and this is an interesting point because a book like Breakfast at Tiffany's, it's a modern book. So, people might ask themselves, how could a modern book be, from printed in 1958, something like that? How could that be rare? But again, we go back to that condition where, if it has, there are only a few copies out there that are in fine condition with a beautiful dust jacket and so forth. And then for the book to be inscribed on top of that, that would be quite rare. So Breakfast at Tiffany's, I'm very much interested in heroines, so Holly Golightly is, a fabulous character. And of course, there is this link with, with cinema and that I'm quite interested. Also forms, the relationship between books, modern books, and other modern arts like 20th century art forms like cinema and television. So I'm interested in that. So also
right.
Another. Are we finished?
No. Go. Tell me. I love it.
Another heroine of mine that I quite like is Sally Bowles from Christopher Isherwood's Goodbye to Berlin. Is one of the stories there, although it was published separately in 1937 by Virginia Woolf's press. So that would be an interesting book to the first edition of just the Sally Bowles story published by Hogarth Press, which is Virginia Woolf's press.
Is that the precursor to the Cabaret story?
That's right. It's based, so the Sally Bowles and the Goodbye to Berlin stories are the basis for many adaptations, films and plays, and the musical and the film with Liza Minnelli, and they're revivals at the moment as we speak in London, I believe. So it's all based on Christopher Isherwood adventures in 1930s Berlin.
Do you know what? You've totally given me a raison d'etre. I'm gonna scour the little shops, and particularly upstate New York where there's less competition, where I have a place.
Yes.
I'll see what I can come up with for you.
Oh my goodness.
I feel a partnership coming on. No, honestly, I can't thank you enough. This really floored me. You surprised me with your beautiful stories. And I'm super excited to hear what you find next. So I can't thank you enough for talking to me.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
All the best. All the best.
And so hopefully they could do a 1-minute thing out of this.
We'll have many 1-minute things.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.